Wait. Hold on. Before you scroll away, you really need to hear this. This is not some bizarre topic. It is not anything gross. In fact, it is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in all of human history. The weirdest part, nobody ever talks about it, which is exactly why we must. Think about it. Half of the entire human population has had to deal with periods for literally as long as humans have existed. We are talking hundreds of thousands of years. Yet, when modern historians write about those ancient empires, they spend 40 pages explaining how Romans built roads, but almost 0 words on how a regular woman survived her period while just trying to live her life. That is a huge gap. Today, we are changing that. We are traveling back. Ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, China, the Aztecs. We are going everywhere, and we will find out exactly what women did, the things they used, what they believed, and honestly, some of the completely wild myths men actually believed about periods throughout history that might make you want to throw your phone across the room. This is the story nobody dared to tell until now, the question ignored for 10,000 years. First, let us clarify something. Periods are not some modern discovery. Surprise, surprise. But you would be shocked how many ancient societies treated it like some kind of mystical event rather than, simple human biology. And that deep confusion, that strange fear, that mix of awe, terror, and absolute nonsense dictated how everyday women were treated by societies for thousands of years. Before we get into the real solutions, like actual pads, the herbal remedies, the rituals, we must understand the culture back then, because those early feminine products weren't just about hygiene, they were about survival, basic social survival, in many cases, literal physical survival. In ancient times, periods were seen as either incredibly sacred or incredibly dangerous, sometimes both at the exact same time. And how society answered that big question, holy or hazardous, decided everything about how women on their cycle could actually live. No pressure, right? Let us start in ancient Egypt, because Egypt, as usual, was doing the absolute most while others were still figuring things out. The Egyptians are among the very first civilizations with real written records, and some of those very documents touch on menstruation. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical scrolls ever discovered, dating back to around 1550 BCE, mentions various women's health issues and cures. The Egyptians weren't ignoring the topic. They actually documented it. Now, what did they actually use? The main theory, backed up by historians and archaeologists, is that local women use softened papyrus as a basic, homemade pad. And honestly, that makes sense. Papyrus was everywhere. It was cheap and surprisingly soft when processed. It was the old world's equivalent of having endless options in your supply closet. Some experts also believe these women might have used rolled-up linen, the very material they used for everything from daily clothes to mummies. Linen was highly absorbent and reusable, practical, efficient, incredibly on-brand for a society inventing calendars, architecture, and dental fillings. But here is the shocker. In ancient Egypt, periods weren't seen as shameful. It connected to fertility, the goddess Isis, and cycles. Even the flooding Nile River, which was the lifeblood of their entire civilization, ran on a cycle, remarkably like a woman's body. Coincidence? The Egyptians certainly didn't think so. Women there weren't locked away, or feared either. They simply kept living their daily lives with almost zero disruption. But compare that to what came next, and you will see why Egypt is the true hero here. Enter ancient Greece, home of democracy and philosophy, but also home to some of the most spectacularly wrong ideas about the human body ever written down. Let us look at Aristotle for a moment, because this highly celebrated thinker, one of history's greatest minds, actually wrote extensively about menstruation, and his conclusions were wild. Aristotle believed that menstrual blood was basically just defective semen. His theory which smart people believed for centuries was that a woman's body tried its best to produce semen, but because female bodies were supposedly much colder and weaker than men's, the process failed, leaving them with menstrual fluid instead. Let that sink in. This was not some fringe idea, but the leading scientific consensus in the entire ancient Greek world, and because of this logic, menstruation became proof of female biological inferiority. Super helpful, right? But leaving aside what elite men wrote in their scrolls, what were women actually doing? Greek women mostly used wool, soft, absorbent, and easy to find in a society built around raising sheep. Wool was their go-to material. Historians believe they made small wool tads or plugs, essentially the earliest tampons, to manage their flow. Even the word tampon has debated origins, but the concept of inserting soft material to absorb flow is ancient. Old Greek medical texts mention women using lint and wool exactly this way. There were also belts and loincloths, snug fabric wraps around hips designed to hold absorbent stuff in place. Not pretty, but functional. What's fascinating is the contrast. On one hand, you have Greek doctors writing detailed medical guides. Hippocrates himself wrote about menstruation as a normal bodily function tied directly to health. Missed periods were seen as medical issues, not some blessing. But then, you also have Aristotle confidently claiming that women are basically broken men. It's so Greek. Brilliant but totally wild. Then came Rome, the empire that built massive aqueducts, concrete, court systems, and Pliny the Elder. Pliny is sort of like history's ultimate version of that one guy at a party who has a very confident take on everything but is wrong about all of it. He wrote that 37-volume book, Natural History, and his section on menstruation is a masterclass in highly confident ignorance. He claimed that menstrual blood would ruin crops if she walked through fields, dull swords if she touched them, turn wine sour, or kill bees, drive dogs mad, and make iron rust, turn bronze black, and repel hailstorms and fierce whirlwinds that last. One actually sounds pretty impressive. Ancient Rome basically believed that women on their periods were walking ecological hazards. You definitely wouldn't invite one to a fancy garden party. Obviously, ordinary Roman women did not actually believe they personally triggered local farming disasters. Life still went on. They visited markets and temples. They raised kids, and Roman women almost certainly used soft cloths, wool, or natural sponges. That sponge in particular pops up quite often in old writings as a health and hygiene aid. The Mediterranean region had easy access to those natural sponges, which would have been an obvious go-to. Highly absorbent, soft, and reusable. After a wash, there is this fascinating debate about a lie by the Roman poet Ausonius, who describes a slave woman using a sponge in a way that some experts believe was linked to period care. It's exactly the subtle clue that researchers love to debate endlessly, which usually means it's probably real. What really stands out is the class divide. Wealthy Roman women had access to premium linen, soft wool, and probably had enslaved servants to handle the washing and preparing of those materials for poorer women, and most of them were. It meant using rougher cloth, scrap rags, or whatever was around. This gap, by the way, is not unique to Rome. It runs deep through every single ancient empire we look at. The difference in what rich women could afford and what everyday women, how they manage, is ancient and consistent. But before we jump forward in history, we need to pause and chat about something that shaped period history way more than any physical invention: pure taboo. In an incredible amount of ancient cultures, periods triggered heavy ritual restrictions, and these strict rules were no minor inconveniences. They completely changed how women could engage in society during their cycles. In ancient Jewish law, specifically Leviticus, a menstruating woman was labeled ritually impure or nida. People could not even touch her, nor could she touch certain objects, and had to undergo ritual cleansing by plunging into a mikveh bath before returning to daily life. These rules had nothing to do with modern standards, they focused on ritual purity, a totally different ballpark. Similar restrictions pop up in ancient Hindu scriptures. The laws of Manu state that man who sleeps with a menstruating woman will lose his wisdom, energy, strength, vision, and long life. Quite a deterrent. Menstruating women in some Hindu traditions were banned from cooking, entering temples, or touching men. Ancient Zoroastrian texts take it even further. Women on their periods were kept isolated in a special zone, given very little food, and denied contact with fire, water, and the earth itself, the sacred elements of their religion. In many indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, bleeding women would temporarily live in special moon lodges or separate huts. The framing varied in some cultures. This was about danger and impurity. In others, it was about her heightened spiritual power during this time. This wasn't about punishment. She was being separated, for better or worse. The practical reality of all this was, women had to manage their monthly cycle. Under these strict rules, being isolated in a moon lodge didn't mean having access to better supplies. It meant you only had what you carried in, plus whatever the community's tradition offered. And more often than not, tradition meant rags or soft leaves. Whatever worked. Now, fast forward to medieval Europe, and look, the Middle Ages get a terrible rap for being unhygienic across the board. And that reputation isn't entirely wrong. For most medieval European women, peasants, townswomen, anyone who wasn't living in a wealthy home, free bleeding was their most likely reality. Heavy wool skirts, layered undergarments, and dark-colored fabrics helped absorb and hide the flow. Women did heavy labor constantly. They kept moving. The thought of stopping daily chores for their period would have been an impossible luxury. Rich women used rags, pieces of soft linen or wool, folded and held in place by a simple belt. These were washed and used again. The practical methods here aren't that different from what women in many parts of the world still use today. What is fascinating about the medieval era is their medical framework. Galenic medicine, passed down from ancient Greece and Rome, twisted and backed up by the Church, still ruled European thinking. Menstruation was seen as the body flushing out excess blood, a natural cleanse. Blocking this natural flow was seen as medically risky. Too much blood would pool inside, causing illness. So, weirdly enough, medieval doctors actually encouraged periods. If a woman's cycle was late or missing, healers would prescribe herbs, herbal steams, and exercises to start it. There was a whole category of herbal remedies called emmenagogues, things that stimulate menstrual flow: parsley, pennyroyal, artemisia, tansy. Medieval healers knew their stuff. Did they actually work? Surprisingly, yes. Several plants in this category have compounds we now know can trigger uterine contractions, which also meant they were used in careful doses for other reasons. The crossover between ancient herbal medicine, birth control, and period management in the ancient world is actually a truly mind-blowing part of history. And it leads perfectly to our next stop. Traditional Chinese medicine had an incredible connection with the female body and periods specifically, unlike Greek and Roman medicine, which often viewed women as basically broken men. Traditional Chinese medicine viewed the female body as its own system, different from a man, but not worse. Periods were a key indicator of overall health. The timing, color, consistency, and amount of menstrual blood were all diagnostic tools for early Chinese healers. Chinese medical texts going back to the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, contained detailed discussions of irregular periods and their causes, imbalances in ched, blood, stagnation, or cold in the uterus. These were all seen as potential causes of period struggles, and they had tailored treatments for each one. In daily life, women use soft cloth pads, typically sewn from silk or cotton depending on their social status. Silk, naturally, was just for the rich. Cotton was far more common, and they kept the pads in place, using woven belts tied around the waist, a setup that looks surprisingly like modern reusable pad holders today. We also have proof from the Tang dynasty, around 600 to 900 CE, of clever undergarments that featured built-in cloth pockets for holding absorbent materials. They are basically the direct ancestors of today's reusable pads. China also built a massive tradition of herbal remedies, specific formulas, many of which are still active in traditional Chinese medicine right now, were designed specifically to regulate the cycle, ease the cramps, and manage flow. These weren't just old superstitions, they were highly detailed, tested recipes passed down through medical families. Here is where the historical record gets frustratingly blank. See the indigenous societies of the Americas, Aztec, Maya, Inca, and hundreds of unique nations across the continent had incredibly complex medical and social practices. Yet, our grasp on how they managed periods is pretty shaky at best, mostly because brutal colonization erased nearly all their written and spoken history. What we can piece together from Aztecs suggests that period blood held immense sacred power. These societies lived by a highly cyclical worldview. Absolutely everything, from farming to battles, followed strict calendars and cosmic rhythms. Women's monthly cycles were never left out of this. Aztec women likely used coarse maguey fibers, the very same plant behind agave, used as an absorbent padding. Maguey was wildly versatile across ancient Mesoamerican culture: food, fiber, medicine, even booze. So fashioning ancient period pads would have made perfect sense back then. In many North American native tribal traditions, the woman resting in her moon lodge had very specific rituals to follow, particular foods she ate, special herbs she gathered, and sacred routines. Far from being some lonely, isolated victim, she was actually in many tribes seen as being at her spiritual peak. The moon lodge was never a punishment for many cultures. It felt more like a monthly sanctuary where women would return from recharged and ready, having finished another cycle. Here is a wild fact that almost always surprises people. Our modern, disposable feminine pads were actually not invented until the late 19th century, and even then, it took decades before regular women in the Western world could even buy them. The first commercial disposable period products appeared around 1888, sold as Lister's towels, made by Johnson & Johnson. They were a total flop. Victorian women felt far too shy to buy them from some male pharmacist over the open counter, so the product quietly failed. It was not until 1921 when Kotex launched a massive ad campaign framing these daily menstrual products as basic health necessities, rather than some shameful, secret item that everyday women bought in. Let that sink in for a moment. For the vast majority of our human story, including the entire span of all those civilizations we have just discussed, women were handling their monthly periods using cloth, wool, sponges, leaves, soft fibers, and whatever else was lying around, and doing it beautifully to live full, active lives. Our modern pad is barely 100 years old. Why? A blink in human evolution, right? We've traveled from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, then Aztecs, and finally Kotex. Let's pause and ask ourselves, what does all of this actually mean? First, women were never helpless victims of their biology. Across every single civilization, how did women craft these clever solutions to a universal bodily reality? They used whatever they had, refining their techniques across generations. They shared that knowledge through spoken word, medical texts, and everyday community practice. Second, why was the obstacle never the materials? Wool was everywhere, and cloth was everywhere. Sponges existed too. In the Mediterranean, the problem was rarely about the materials. The real issue was the social framework surrounding periods. When a society decided that bleeding was dangerous, dirty, or shameful, it restricted women's movement, work, and social life. when a culture decided it was natural or even sacred, women continued their lives with little interruption. The physical tools were practically identical, but the cultural fallout was radically different. Third, men wrote most history books, and they wrote from an outsider's view. Pliny's wild list of things Tyrian blood could allegedly ruin tells us zero about what Roman women really went through. It shows what those men fear and misunderstood. The real wisdom, the practical, generational, lived experience of what worked, was kept alive by women, and almost never recorded in writing. That is a loss, a genuine historical tragedy we are still piecing together. Before we wrap up, there's one more thing. We've covered pads, cloths, and sponges, but we haven't mentioned pain. Why? Because menstrual cramps are incredibly real. They're physical, painful, and they've always been around. No, it's not a modern invention. Actually, ancient medical texts from every culture we've discussed contain descriptions of painful periods and ways to treat them. The Greeks used warm wine compresses and herbal teas. Roman doctors prescribed exercise, while Chinese medicine had complex recipes. Medieval Europeans relied on their herbal cramp remedies, and almost always, the specific plants that show up in all these traditions have one major thing in common: they actually work, or at least, many of them contain active compounds that trigger real physical effects. Chamomile, ginger, cinnamon, and fennel, these weren't random choices. They represent centuries of trial and error from generations of women testing things out and sharing results. The real irony is that, despite the utter nonsense men wrote about menstruation like Aristotle's wild semen theory or Pliny's crop-killing superstitions, and all those harsh religious impurity laws, women's practical medical remedies were incredibly advanced. Women figured it out because they had to. We build massive museums dedicated to ancient weapons and reconstruct old battle tactics in painstaking detail. We produce countless documentaries about emperors, conquerors, and kings, yet the daily life of half the population, that raw, intimate, universal reality of periods, barely gets mentioned in mainstream history. It's not in the films, it's missed in school curriculum and ignored by academia, written history, until quite recently. Yet, this is actually one of the most universal human experiences we have ever shared. Every generation of women, in every civilization, on every continent, faced this, and they found solutions. They built up knowledge and passed it down. That's history, and honestly, it's fascinating history. Why did we have to title this video with a slightly edgy question just to get you to click? It says a lot about how we have trained ourselves to look at history, and what we decide is actually worth our attention. So next time someone acts like discussing periods is somehow taboo or inappropriate, just remind them Cleopatra dealt with this, Roman women did too, medieval peasants dealt with it, Aztec priestesses dealt with this. It is literally ancient history, and it is about time we started treating it exactly like that.